Hi again, all sharing fans. This is David Epstein, the Workday Sharing Guy, and I'm introducing at the Reporting Share-a-thon that I'm facilitating today with Floyd Walter House in Chicago, something that I call a calculated field trainer. I find as I have introduced calculated fields to several people over the past 10 years, that for some people, those who are comfortable and familiar with Excel, it might be better to start off with an example in Excel. For example, here we have a column for first name, a column for last name. Now let's say that we needed to create, call it a username. It's the first initial of the first name, and then the last name concatenated together. So for example, Carol Martin would be C. Martin. So this field, we would call it perhaps username. My question is, if you know Excel, you're familiar with Excel, how would you write this? How would you go from two columns, Carol Martin, and you would add this column here? So imagine that column did not exist and you needed to create that column. How would you do that in Excel? What I mean is, what code would you write, or how would you handle doing this? Not manually. Of course, this shows only 8 lines of data, but you have to imagine that you have a whole report that you ran in Workday. So what I've done is I've run a report in the Workday GMS tenant, and I've copied the data here. It would also work for the AMU tenant or your tenant. Any report data, copy and paste it here. Now the answer I usually get as to how I would do it in Excel has something to do with using a mechanism in which to get the leftmost character of the first name. In Workday Calculated Fields, that's called a substring. And when you create a substring calculated field, you have a choice of going before delimiter, going after delimiter, going between delimiters, or a fixed position substring. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to take the first character. You're not allowed to just put a position with a value 1. You need to use another calculated field. So I've created two different calculated, or one calculated field here called CF1, which is just the value 1. I actually have a naming convention for calculated fields that start all calculated fields with a ZCF, and then numeric constant would be NMC. But that made the demo a little bit hard to see, and so those two, starting position and then fixed length, is both the value 1. So what do you need to do next? You need to concatenate that first calculated field that you created with the column in the report called LName. So let's take a look at the results. I click a button to put the values that came from that report alternating with orange columns. And in the orange column, you could select any calc field. So for example, I put the first initial here in column B, and then the first initial and last name, essentially what we call the username, here in column D. Again, I got that after copying and pasting a report into this tab, and then I click in here to populate the layout tab. So let's click to generate the output. It brings us here to the layout tab, and you see here is the first initial, and then here is the last name. I'll scroll down so that you could see some that actually start with a B or a C, and there it is. So this column here, column D, is what I was calling the username. And so I have found this as one way in which to get people started just thinking appropriately for calculated fields. You can't just say first initial and then last name and put them together. You have to say first, get the first initial, then concatenate that with the last name. So there's two different calculated fields that you need. That's the important lesson here. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Workday Calculated Fields. Find me at Workday Rising this year in Chicago if you'd like to talk more about calculated fields.